Hi, my name is Brian Walsh. We recognize that we are the last thing between standing between you guys and cocktails, so we will try to move along expeditiously. You've heard mention of the Prince George's County delivery method for, in this case, trying to figure out how to retrofit a stormwater system. And what we'd like to do is talk a little bit about how that delivery method has come about and how things are working right now. And our panelists include Josh Pierre, who is Associate County Attorney for Prince George's County, and he really supervised the negotiation of the contracts that form the basis of the arrangement. Pam Schools with Corvius, which is the private contractor for doing this, and she's done a lot of development in different places, not only with Corvius but with other companies. And finally, Dan Nees, who is with the Environmental Finance Center in University of Maryland, and his work focuses on developing innovative market and performance-based financing policies and systems to reduce the cost of environmental compliance at state and local levels. I mean, what we've heard about in previous panels is, just the cost and impact and the cost challenge of trying to respond to some of the EPA requirements that are out there, and looking forward to sort of future challenges and requirements. Prince George's County has gotten a lot of generally good publicity for trying to do this through a P3 model. Now, what is a P3? Quickly, it is more than, any contract between a government and a private entity is a P3, right? But in fact, when people talk P3 now, they're looking at the ways in which you procure. It's generally a large capital asset or an enterprise, the way you contract and allocate risk in connection with that enterprise, and the way you finance that enterprise. And the traditional, and it's really a way to try to assess and evaluate the feasibility of designing, constructing, operating, maintaining, and financing a big project or a complicated project or enterprise over its life. And the way things work today, in what we call the traditional paradigm, is that all too frequently planning, especially design planning, is done by the government, or its contractor, and then the construction portion of a project is done through a procurement in which the person that submits a low seal bid wins. At the end of construction, the project is turned back to the government. The government is responsible for operating and maintaining it. As you can imagine, it's no surprise if you have entities just responsible for one segment, they don't have to look at the entire project over its life, and that creates problems and I think inefficiencies. The issue is, can the government, and how does a government go about trying to procure on a basis, and the standard you'll hear is best interests for the government over the life of the project. It may be cost, but hopefully it includes other things like speed of delivery, innovation, importantly, risk allocation. The governments are looking at, how can I take risks that we've always assumed, like O&M risk, the inflation of O&M risks, and assign those risks to the private sector. The analysis that local governments or state governments try to do is they try to figure out the cost over the cycle of the life cycle of a project as a baseline, and then they compare the projected costs of doing the project through a P3 delivery method. That's called a value for money analysis, and that's supposed to be what you compare your P3 result with, or during your P3 selection process. You compare that to the baseline. In any event, financing, we'll talk more about later, but typically financing for large capital projects by the government has been done through appropriations, maybe federal assistance, maybe issuance of general obligation tax-exempt bonds. Generally, that just covers construction, and then you think of operation and maintenance as sort of pay as you go. The question is, are there other ways to find money sources? And in P3s, you may be able to get the involvement of the private sector, which may add some value to UA and may give you that last 20% that you need to finish the project. In any event, remember, P3s are not free. I mean, you wouldn't have private sector entities doing this if they were going to go out for business. I mean, they're there to make a fair return on investment. And I can tell you, having done work for the government in P3s, the private sector is very much focused on, well, okay, we can do this, but we want to make this return on investment, so we'll just have to adjust price. And they are consequently generally receptive to policies that, or implementing certain, I'll say policies that the private sector may not implement on its own. A good example in Pennsylvania would be, we want to use union labor, or we want to use Pennsylvania Steel or U.S. Steel. And if you say that to the contractor in a P3 competition, they'll say, okay, we just will add that cost, and sort of effectively pass it through. But if you've got competition, hopefully, you'll end up with a better price. Other states, Virginia doesn't have a mandatory union. So you can impose those kinds of requirements. There's usually minority, small business, women-owned enterprise requirements, although not specifically applicable to a contractor that is contracting with the private sector. The government can impose that requirement through its contract with the concessionaire, on the concessionaire, which can be helpful. A note, today we're going to talk about P3s that involve building or rehabilitating assets. We're not going to talk about, but we can talk offline if you want, about P3s that involve the sale of a government asset. Some of you from Pennsylvania are familiar with the city of Allentown sold off its water and sewer system. I was involved in that transaction, and I can talk about it if you want afterwards. But anyway, Prince George's County, Josh, Maryland suburbs of D.C., 500 square miles, 900,000 people, large urban areas, Anacostia River, Patuxent River, Potomac River, 46,000 stormwater devices in PG County. Agriculture, rural uses have been reduced, but you've got a lot of impermeable property. And I guess starting in 2012, the EPA really put the pressure on Maryland to impose requirements on counties and municipalities. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit, and I know they gave people the authority to impose fees, and you guys went ahead and did that. And I wonder if you could talk about your stormwater fee.
I can try. I came in a little bit after it was passed by the local county. We're located, for those who don't know, just on the right side, cradling Washington, D.C. So we were in a very good location for the stick. So as you know, necessity is always a mother of invention. So there was some pressure coming towards the county to really step up its urban retrofit. At the same time, with the whole Chesapeake watershed, there was an emphasis by the EPA to really clamp down on stormwater retrofits all around the Chesapeake watershed, and we were a little behind, to just put it mildly. And so with the law that was passed in Maryland, initially it was mandatory that the 10 biggest jurisdictions, including Baltimore City and our county and other counties, all had to impose either a tax or a stormwater fee to collect the necessary funds to be aggressive in the stormwater treatment that was mandated by our MS4 permits, and also to meet our waste load allocations. So that was a very popular enactment, as you know. There was a reaction to that. It went from initially a mandatory enactment, and with the new government administration, it went to voluntary on the part of the jurisdictions. However, even if it was voluntary, they still made sure that you understood that all of the accelerated obligations that are imposed through the Chesapeake watershed requirements and through our MS4 permits still apply. So the county made the decision to maintain our stormwater fee instead of a tax. And I think the rationale for that was to try to capture as many different interests that we have that have large impervious areas on their property. So that includes not just residents and commercial interests, but we have a fair amount of churches that have large, sprawling parking lots, and tax would automatically exempt them. But with the fee structure, we were able to encompass them not only to assist in the cost, but also we put in a rebate program that actually encouraged them to do certain retrofits on their parking lots, and we could actually use some of their acreage to meet our obligations.
And I think the fee was per property, how much impermeable property do you have fee. But importantly, what it did was it created a revenue stream.
That's correct.
One thing that's important to point out about what happened in Maryland is that was called House Bill 987. It's passed by the O'Malley administration. If it sounds familiar, he's running for president, and I think he has a 0.5%.
Right.
That might be generous, actually. But the new administration ran on an anti-rain tax platform. And so they negotiated with it. So he's a Republican. Maryland is a heavily Democratic state as it relates to their legislature, not as it relates to their counties. So they negotiated. And as Josh said, they came up with this voluntary system. However, it was a classic example. You better be careful what you wish for.
Right.
Because MDE agreed to very strict enforcement of the Clean Water Act and the MS4 permits, which in Maryland, in Phase 1 MS4 communities, requires retrofitting 20% of the impervious surface that hasn't been treated to the maximum extent practicable, which is a very heavy lift.
Very aggressive.
And so now they all cheered because they didn't have to implement fees, yet now they had this really aggressive enforcement coming on top of them, and the only way to pay for it was with a fee. And so there's one jurisdiction that's going to repeal their fee. I got about 15 emails yesterday asking me what we think is going to happen. I said, wait.
Right.
They'll have a fee. In just a matter of time, they're going to revert themselves because they're going to get audited and they're going to be in trouble. So the reason why that's important with other fees is that's what's going to drive fees coming in place. It's going to be enforcement of the Clean Water Act, not passing bills requiring local governments to put fee systems in place.
And in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that the permit now requires that whether they have a fee or not, that they demonstrate that they have the ability to pay for the retrofits.
Yeah, and that's actually common to most jurisdictions now in Phase 1s. They have to have reasonable assurance that they have the financial capacity to implement.
Well, Josh, how did the county think about looking maybe into doing this as a P3 project as opposed to just having someone maybe design some improvements or just hiring people on staff to do the operations and maintenance?
I think it was just looking at the enormity of the project and the obligation. Like I said, we were a little bit behind, to put it mildly. So we had an obligation to try to retrofit, I think it's at least 8,000 acres by 2017. And I think a total of 15,000 acres by 2025. Looking at the enormity of the obligation, and and our capacity was not possible. And, we also had some strong incentives based on a consent order that was coming down our way. So we had regulation, pressures, and obligations, capacity, and other obligations that our agency also has to manage under their normal duties. So looking at the problem and trying to find a solution is what led to the idea of being open to doing something different. And the idea was maybe we could use a different paradigm to try to accomplish this very enormous undertaking. And so the concept was born of maybe we can do a P3 as the model to go ahead and try to do this aggressive retrofit program.
And my recollection is that you have the authority as sort of a modified home rule county to do a procurement that's based on more than just low bid.
That's correct.
For construction.
That's correct.
Which was important. And so how did the RFQ process go? I mean, a lot of times what you'll see is there'll be a couple of phases. First, the government will ask people generally to submit a request, a statement of qualifications. It's financial, it's engineering, it's experience, it's who your team is and other things. And then there'll be a decision at some point. Sometimes it's two parts. You shortlist people and then keep going. Sometimes it's you make a pick. But the trick is you're not making your pick on the basis of low construction price. But you guys decide, how did the RFP process work?
That's correct. That's essentially how our first proposal hit the street. It didn't ask for a price. We did ask for a request for qualifications, and it basically listed some of the very items that you listed just now. And the plan was that once we looked at that, we would make an assessment of the firms that submitted. I think of all the firms that submitted, there was 3 that were looked at very closely. They were scored. We selected the one that rated the highest, and we decided to then enter into negotiations. I mean, this was something that after doing research and being allocated to the project, couldn't find a contract off the shelf. We couldn't find a paradigm off the shelf that we could take and say, okay, we've seen here's a good stormwater P3 contract that we can apply to put this program in place. So literally it was now taking the concepts that we had all discussed, the outcomes that was desired, and now trying to work to bring that into a finished product.
And Pam, how did Corvius get involved? How did you find out about this, and how did you guys approach it?
So during discussions with the EPA and another region, it was brought to our attention that there was a strong need for stormwater management in Region 3. And it came about because of the work that we do with communities for the Department of Defense. We have 26 P3 relationships across the country, and a part of those relationships is stormwater management on the acreage that we're responsible for. And so in some discussions with leadership in that region, including some representatives from Prince George's County, we came to learn that this was a strong driver in the region, and we began to really look at it more deeply. And it was through the conversations with the EPA and Prince George's County around developing something beyond just a traditional contract, something that had triple bottom line benefits, something that would do something beyond just installing green infrastructure, but also bringing some benefits to the community. And Prince George's County felt very strongly about that. And that's really what interested us in participating in the process.
Could you talk a little bit, Josh, about the economic development component that's built into this?
Sure. That is really the central driver. I recall, and I had to repeat that during our negotiations, that our political representatives, what interested them in even trying this new model for going out and being first was the potential of it being used as an economic development project as well. And that was their primary interest, because our estimates was maybe 1.2 billion would have to be spent to become compliant with our retrofit obligations. That's an enormous task, an enormous undertaking, and the only way that you could even possibly get them interested in taking that leap was to tie it in with the possibility that this big undertaking, this big program, could be used to be a significant economic development project in the county. So,
and the components of that economic development, I recognize this, if Corvius has the O&M responsibility, then, that becomes something of a fixed cost for the county.
Yes.
Over time. But what kind of requirements were imposed on you guys in terms of economic development?
So there were a couple of key points for the county that were important to them. They had announced their Jobs First initiative, in which it was important to them that local residents and local small disadvantaged businesses be utilized as much as possible in all the work that's done in the county. And so part of our fixed fee is about the performance of those two metrics. In particular, that we will utilize 30 to 40% of the local small disadvantaged businesses in the scope of the work that we do in the county. And in addition, I believe it's 50%, 52% of the workforce will be residents of the county. And that's a significant lift. And we do that through workforce development, through working with the community colleges and the other training programs in the area to get sort of green certifications going and training going for the workforce, but also sort of surrounding the small businesses in the area and helping them to develop the programs that they need to have in place to grow and expand. For instance, one of the things that we do is we take on the bonding of the programs to reduce the barrier of entry for small businesses who many times can't or don't have the time to go get the bonding to participate in government contracts. We bond it at the program level, and that allows them to participate in the program more fully and really expand their scope of work within the county. So it was initiatives like that we've put in place in conjunction with the county to really drive the Jobs First initiative.
I could recall letting Corvius know right up front that we could achieve the most pristine, cleanest waters in the region, but if it was done with outside folks entirely, it would be considered a failure outright and would not be considered a positive program. So we were intentional in designing the contract so really their incentives, their maximizing their revenues were intimately tied with ensuring that there was local participation in residential workforce as well as in the business.
What were your biggest challenges in terms of negotiating the contract? And you ended up with two contracts, or?
Yeah, we had a master program agreement, which basically dealt with the design, build, and construction phase, and then we did a master maintenance agreement, which is a long-term operations and maintenance of the agreement. So the biggest challenge was we were really the first. We had nothing to rely on as a template. So we had ideas, we had objectives, but how do we put it down on paper? How do we properly allocate risk? How do we address the fact that we're not dealing with a huge, big, a facility that you can touch, see, hear, but it's really a whole bunch of small green infrastructures that are being, installed all over the county. I remember being amazed when after doing all this work and going out and realizing that what we're talking about is a couple of gardens and some trees and bioswales, but all together they accomplish something very significant. But looking at them individually, this is what we were spending almost 14 to 15 months trying to put together a very complex relationship.
And I should mention at the same time that Corvius is implementing this rehabilitation, the county separately is doing the same program in-house. So when a county or a government is planning to do something through a P3 delivery method, and I talked about the value for money analysis, it's projections. But here you're going to have sort of the real thing.
That's correct. As we were negotiating, it became apparent that because of just the sheer size of what we have to accomplish in such a short time period, the county would have to simultaneously be doing its own retrofit programs. And since this was described as a pilot, and I mentioned this every time we were in a hard spot of negotiation, that we're first, so we're going to be a case study. That's a given. The question is, are we going to be a positive case study or are we going to be a negative? So what we decided is if this is a pilot, then let's treat it as a pilot. Let's try to set it up so that the county would be doing similar projects as Corvius. And that way both sides would be pushing each other to try to gain efficiencies and savings, and we could do a true analysis of whether or not this pilot, this paradigm, actually is a smarter, cheaper, faster, and better way of achieving our obligations.
And what
I might
happens?
suggest that you boxed yourself in a little bit, because if you're wrong, then you found out that the contract you signed didn't work. If you're right, you found out that your government's inefficient. I mean, the private sector.
Yes.
I was just wondering if I got that right.
No, you got it right. That's exactly right. It was interesting because our DCAO would say he fully expected that somewhere, somehow, it should balance out. Because if one side was attaining certain efficiencies, he said he fully expected that the other side should be looking over the fence and saying, what are you doing? Let's make sure we're adjusting our methods to gain the same efficiencies. We're already starting to see some of that. I think there's a permitting process that traditionally takes 30 to 60 days. I think they've been able to achieve like a 7 to 10 day turnaround. So you're already seeing certain innovation that wouldn't have happened but for this paradigm.
And the good news is we're not pitted against each other. We work very closely. We're actually in the same building as the DPW team, and so we're sharing information all the time with them. In fact, we have a weekly operations meeting with all of the project leads, including representatives from the county, and we freely share information back and forth about what we're seeing in the field, about what we're encountering, and so we really are pushing each other to be better and better.
What have you guys done, Corvius, on the economic development front?
So we've already completed our first project in the first 100 days of the program. The first project out of the gate happened to be private property through the alternative compliance program. It was a church. And the results from that already are driving costs down below 18% or 18% lower. We used 85% local disadvantaged businesses in that particular project. So we're seeing the results that the county expected and that we will be paid upon.
Exactly.
Have they paid you yet? How does payment work? I mean, do you just pay them a monthly fee, or in construction? How does it?
Should we go into the budget book process? There's a process in place whereby we provide what we will do the project for and the timeline we expect to do it and how much of the local businesses will use. The county approves that. We have a discussion about it and they approve it. We approve it. Once we've completed the work, then a third party does a confirmation that the work was completed and completed to contract specifications, and then payment is made. And it's a flat performance-based fee. And so we get a certain percent flat for doing the work, and then if we meet the additional economic drivers that we've discussed, we get the additional amount. So it's not an incentive to earn more fee. This is to earn our fee.
The right way.
Exactly.
Let me switch if I could. I know, Pam, as fate has it, you've covered a number of the things that are in your presentation, and I just had a couple questions for Dan. Dan, what should governments be thinking about if they're thinking about using a P3 method to do this kind of work? I mean, what would you tell them? Here's the pros, here's the cons. This sounds like a good program so far.
Yeah, it does actually, and I have no doubt it will be a good program. Well, the primary thing that governments have we're talking about stormwater right now, which is different than a lot of other infrastructure, in that it's about to be heavily regulated. And so Prince George's County has a huge hammer over its head right now. And if it's not in compliance, it could get very expensive for them. And so this relationship with Corvius is ultimately about that. It's about 2025. That's the date that the judge has set that all of the states have to be in compliance and implementing their plans to restore and protect the Chesapeake Bay. And so that creates a level of complexity in what they're doing that's unlike many other P3s. But the primary thing that they have to think about is exactly what Josh was talking about, which is efficiency, and what you brought up before, which is risk. Because the only reason you do this is because it is cheaper. It's the only reason a government enters into a P3 at all, because it's cheaper. Corvius is going to use the same backhoes, the same labor, the same property. Everything is going to be the same, but there's this presumption that they can do it more efficiently, more effectively, because they're the market, they're the private sector. That's the only reason to do it. And then directly connected to that is risk. Josh was also correct. This is a totally different kind of infrastructure. It is not a pipe. It's not a road. It's not a thing that you can look and value and set and then do the procurement based on that value. It is a series of interconnected, sometimes often disaggregated, best management practices in the thousands across a municipality or a jurisdiction like Prince George's County. And how you pay for that and finance that has a lot of risk associated with it. And so the P3 provides the government a chance to put risk where it belongs, which is in the marketplace. So those are quite honestly the two things that I think should be considered. There are others that you brought up before, innovation, scale, things like that, but ultimately they are all embedded into efficiency and risk.
But you think there's potential for real savings?
Well, I do, and I think
properly managed.
The little competition that Prince George's County's got going right now is a good example of it. If that actually works, and if your colleague is true, that everything is going to balance out, and that the two sides are going to be watching the other, and they're both going to kind of do the same thing, what you just saw was efficiency and government. Those two words are rarely used together, by the way. But that's what would be happening. Well, that would presume, I'm sorry to say this, but that would presume they aren't going to need Corvius someday, right? Because now they're going to be efficient, and they're doing all of these things that they should have been doing, quite honestly, in the first place. And to me, that's the real value of what's going on here. So the financing is fascinating, and it really is fascinating. It'll be more fascinating for people like me when Prince George's County and Corvius actually release the contract, so we can see it and how this is actually going to work. But Josh has said it'll be a few days from now, and we'll get it.
We're getting there.
And the whole thing will be blacked out, and we're not going to get it. But the real value of this is efficiency in government and the use of markets in the private sector to cause government to be more efficient. And that's what Prince George's County was doing from the beginning.
I think, too, another important part, and this was brought up on an earlier panel as well, is the discussion around O&M and the assets life cycle. So if you have a financeable project, if you include O&M over a 30-year period, you have a financeable project. And so it makes it a much more valuable infrastructure project. In addition, because you've maintained that well over 30 years, that means it's working. You know, we all are encountering situations where BMPs have been installed over the last 5 years that weren't well maintained, in part because local municipalities and jurisdictions didn't have the money to do the O&M. They have been struggling to meet the other basic needs of their communities.
And I should mention that it's not atypical for a long-term O&M contract to require the contractor to return the asset in a specified condition. And you typically would, during the last 5 or 10 years of the term of the contract, require the contractor to start setting aside money that it couldn't distribute to itself or else to get a letter of credit, and you would you would have meetings to determine, where you are with respect to meeting those levels, so that when the contract ends, you've restored things, or else, you have the money.
And
Should be
typically, our
sufficient.
projects at budget book time include the long-term O&M, and we've actually had the maintenance contractors at the table with us when we look at the BMPs for that specific project, so we have a realistic expectation of what will be needed. And so we try to look at it very holistically and make a really well-thought-out decision as to what the cost of that project truly is over the course of the 30 years.
A question for Josh. I know that Corvius set up a special purpose entity to do this project. How did you get comfortable with that? I mean, they're a big company, and they just created this little peanut.
Well, I would say one of the last issues that was fairly contentious was the guarantee agreement that was connected to the master program agreement. Because exactly, you're correct. It was a special purpose entity. The only asset there is the contract and the revenue stream that comes from that contract. But as the initial contract is a $100 million contract, so we have a lot invested. So we basically had to negotiate how much risk and how much on the hook we were going to put the parent company, and that got contentious, but we worked out, I think, a very fair agreement that allocated the risk and made sure that we had deep pockets to ensure that they were properly invested in the project.
And I should say it's not at all unusual. In fact, it's probably typical that a big company doing a project like this would set up a single purpose entity. That's not at all unusual.
Right.
Well, Pam, if you want to go through your slides, you can. We can take questions.
We should take questions. I'd be curious to know what you want to know.
Sure.
You had mentioned the project by project, each of these projects, and they all add up to a system that gives you the stormwater management. How do you measure that? Is it based on the performance of a BMP alone? But if you're assuming it adds up, give you the outcome?
That was always my question, and that actually was also the second very contentious issue, because we literally were asking, well, how do you test it? What do? You put a water truck at the top of the hill and you let it go and then you measure it. Everyone said you have to trust the science. We know that the technology for measuring effectiveness is very expensive, and it's premature really at this stage, so really
not required.
Exactly. Right. And that was ultimately what made us decide, look, you trust the science. If the science says that a certain BMP accomplishes X, then you use that model to measure that as long as it's been installed and placed correctly the way it's supposed to, we make the assumption that it works, and if we get the credit for that from our masters who are holding us to that obligation, then that's what we'll take.
The Bay restoration effort is guided by the world's largest watershed model, and it's run by EPA and the University of Maryland and Virginia Tech and some others. And it basically says, here are well, I'm not even going to begin to go into the model, but basically it says what the practices are that are allowable. Right. And so if you put those practices on the ground as designed, then you are in compliance. Whether or not they're doing anything, that's not for you to worry about. But you're in compliance with your permit if you're doing that.
But even though it's not required as a part of our relationship to do ongoing monitoring of the BMP's success rate, if you will, one of the things that we're doing is talking with some industry leaders who are doing that monitoring in other parts of the country to see if there's a way we can cost effectively put that in place for lots of reasons, part of which is part of the maintenance, to be able to identify more quickly that something needs to have some maintenance done to it, but also to try to quantify some of the success ratios, because we feel confidently as well that this will garner the results that are expected, and that will ensure further implementation across the country, which is what we're hoping for.
Sure.
So this question of technical performance and metrics is really kind of intriguing. But I'm also kind of curious going back to the other aspects that each of you mentioned, because I was listening carefully and it sounded like you were all from different planets. Because, you know, Josh really mentioned all of the economic development drivers. Yes, compliance, but not, you know, had to be sandwiched with economic development. Pam, you were very clear. You articulated the triple bottom line and you made that, you know, you made that point. But Dan, you said at the end it always just comes down to efficiency and financial value. So
I am the Environmental Finance Center, by the way, so by not.
You're all speaking the same language but different dialects. But it, you know, how do you reconcile it? And I guess I would add, like, how would you price resilience and things like that? I mean, how would you value resilience? And maybe you can speak from your vantage points about that.
Well, I would suggest that we bring different perspectives, not just because of where we were. I was actually nowhere in the process, and we were, you know, at an academic institution, just looking down and watching. They were on. They do a lot of. By the way, Corvius and Prince George's County do a lot of holding hands in public events. You know, it was a great partnership, and it was all about the people and everything else. Like, no, they were great negotiators, and so they were on opposite sides of the table. But I still think it comes down to efficiency, and here's why. I'll take the economic impact issue. That impacts the cost associated with the BMPs they're going to put on the ground, right? So if you say that you have to use local labor, you've now, by definition, increased the cost of implementation because you've lowered the availability of a factor of production, and so you're going to increase the cost. So they got to balance that. They're now no longer maximizing something. They're doing an optimization problem. They're saying we want to get the practice, we want to get the environmental performance, we want to get cost reduction, and we want economic impact. And they got to bundle all that stuff up, but it still comes down to their $100 million.
Right.
And they got to get all of those things with their $100 million, and they got to add it all up and see if they got all those things more efficiently than they otherwise would have had they not come into it. So by the way, we are not from different places. University of Maryland is the largest institution within Prince George's County, usually a very bad citizen of the community when it comes to water quality. And so it was very important for us to be watching what was going on. So we care very much about this relationship and what it's going to mean. So that's why I think we see from a different perspective, but I think I win. It comes down to efficiency in the long run.
They're also exempt.
Yeah, we are.
In the back.
Questions. One is similar vein. You talked about selecting. There was a little bit about the deal prior to this, so I don't know, probably Trey might know already, but I know that there was a group of 3 or 4 that were shortlisted, and that at least 2 of those companies were water sort of engineering companies, and then Corvius has a engineering partner. So I wanted to understand first, what was the selection process for the Corvius engineering team? And then sort of related to that, I'm going to sort of maybe challenge the notion that the innovation thing is not important because, I mean, could the county really manage this kind of distributed construction project with these new different technologies across the county without private assistance from a water specialist? Or you guys really could have done that just as an engineering matter and essentially without having this private engineering?
I don't think the county was convinced that we had the capacity and the knowledge base to really manage the complexity of this project on such a broad scale, as well as managing all of the other obligations that are still part of that specific agency's bailiwick. How we selected a Corvius, I mean, it wasn't a wide disparity. I think all 3 that were shortlisted put together a very strong proposal. But at the end, I think when those who were scoring and doing the assessment of what was presented by the firms, Corvius just won out in their holistic approach. I can't say there was one magic a bullet point that made all the difference. But I just think at the end they were just slightly stronger in their presentation. That's how they were selected.
Yeah, practical pointer, if you're representing a government that is doing a P3 procurement, it is essential that the private sector participants feel as if the process is even-handed and transparent, and if you're able to indicate to some extent the bases on which you're going to make a determination, that's really helpful too. That said, what you want to do if you're in the government sector is you want to basically end up with 3 people who are just dying to do the deal. And that will tend more than anything else to shift the risk allocation. But, you know, these guys really were sort of first impression. So it's, you know, and it's risk allocation in other areas. Transportation is the easy example. There is some sort of fairly long track record and people know what the market is, and that's not the case here.
I just want to respond quickly to your comment on innovation. I wasn't throwing innovation under the bus or belittling. Actually, my entire career has been focused on markets and the way that they can incentivize innovation. I was suggesting that innovation is part of efficiency, because if you come up with practices that are able to perform better per dollar spent, you've just improved efficiency. So that's what I was saying there. I wasn't meaning to say it wasn't important. It's vital to this relationship.
And if I could add to that, we were actually intentional about some of the provisions we put in about innovation. One of the things we did is, as a means of a cost savings, we pay for the design costs. That's part of the cost that the county bears. But what we did is we put in some contingency. We're saying we were encouraging innovation. EPA, NDE were encouraging innovation. We said we'll pay for innovation. If you want to design something that's new, you want to do some of the testing, we'll pay for it. However, if we pay for innovation, you transfer the intellectual property rights to us up front. So then we have a property interest. However, if you think what you have is the next mousetrap and you want to hold on to that intellectual property, then you do the design costs. We give you the place to test it, but we don't have to pay for the design costs. So that was the trade-off. So up front, if you're doing innovation, that's how we did it. We said if you want to do something new, you want to test it, we'll be the guinea pig, but we're not going to pay for the design costs, so we get a savings. But if you really need the help with us financing the design costs, we'll take that on, but in return, you transfer the intellectual property rights.
And the way that translates in the real world is we actually have some designers and suppliers who have new technology they want to test, and they now have a platform to do that on multiple sites where we can get real data at the time. And so we're in discussions with a few suppliers for exactly that reason.
One more?
I'm sorry if this is a naive question, but the consultants, so consultants on the design side and alternatively the contractors on the installation side, they contracted with whom exactly? With everybody contracted with you?
Yeah.
Subcontract, okay.
We only wanted to look to one party.
And it eliminates, I mean, if the design team says, the construction team says the design is flawed, it's her problem. It's not Josh's problem.
Warranty. There's one overarching warranty that gets delivered to the county.
Well, sometimes there's an assignment of warranties by subcontractors that get assigned to the government, and if you leverage finance it, they're assigned
So that ends a
security.
little more complicated.
Well, but in the perspective of the county, you're right. The county's like, that's the reason they did it. They're like,
That's what I was trying
yeah,
to
if you said you put it on the ground, it's your business whether or not they did it right. They did it wrong.
You're
you
not
gotta
chasing
replace it.
after any individual.
Exactly.
That's part of why we also have a third party who
Verifies.
confirms that it's accurately, it's been put in the ground the right way. It's an assurance for our constituents, and it's an assurance for the county as well. I know we're just about out of time.
Thank you very much, folks. Harry, you don't have the last word. Who has
We have one closing remark from our compatriots at ELI, and he promised to make it short, and we'll meet you at the cocktail.
Great. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I got a shout out from Harry earlier, but I'm Brett Cordy. I'm the manager of professional education at the Environmental Law Institute. I'd like to thank Ballard Spahr for giving us the opportunity to co-sponsor this event once again. It's something that we're proud to put our name on every single year. And I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you all to give another round of applause for all of our panelists today and the organizers of this event. I know what it takes to put something like this on. Now, I would just like to share with you a few of the ways that ELI is collaborating with our partners to develop law-based solutions to address many of the problems and issues we've discussed today. ELI is working to encourage development of green infrastructure on private land rather than relying on public land and rights-of-way, along with developing ordinances that guarantee access to the financial accountability of such projects. We also encourage the profession to explore ways to integrate public and private lands into effective and fundable green infrastructure projects. One panel discussed enforcement issues that arise when city systems are unable to adequately handle intense stormwater events, leading to violations of statutes like the CWA. Here again is an opportunity for law-based solutions to address liability concerns related to the long-term success of green infrastructure projects. The panel discussed some interesting ways that workable enforcement orders come together, but consider what would happen if statutory and policy solutions could be implemented that better accommodate GI and prevent some of the more challenging enforcement situations from arising in the first place. And of course, we talked about the impacts of a changing climate on our already deteriorating infrastructure. We also touched on some of the new infrastructure that we're going to need to sustain our great cities. Climate change promises to require trillions of dollars, we've heard that word a few times today, in infrastructure improvements. But the climate crisis presents opportunities to make drastic changes to the status quo that will help us move towards a more sustainable society overall. We don't have to wait for politics to catch up with the science on climate change. We can work in our own communities to build resilience now. And by removing impediments to GI and existing ordinances, we can help some of these localities use more green infrastructure sooner. So please keep in mind that the places like Philadelphia and DC that have already done a lot of good work with this aren't necessarily the ones that need all of our help. As I mentioned, ELI is committing to facilitating community building among green infrastructure professionals. For example, in the June issue of our Environmental Law Reporter, we ran a discussion transcript on lessons learned from GI projects in New York and DC, as well as strategies for successful implementation of future projects. We've studied the role of wetland buffers in land use planning and continue to publish great books dealing with green infrastructure and other sustainability issues. I've had the opportunity to speak with some of you about the benefits of ELI membership. Our mission is to foster innovative, just, and practical law and policy solutions to enable leaders across borders and sectors to make environmental, economic, and social progress. I hope you all consider joining with us as we work towards that vision. If you hadn't had a chance to check out some of my materials that I brought along today, my table's right out here. I would also be happy to chat with any of you. Please join us for the reception, and thanks again for being here.